Welcome to GW Integrative Medicine, the podcast about disease prevention and health promotion from the Office of Integrative Medicine and Health at the George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences.
I'm Dr. Misha Kogan, Associate Professor of Medicine here at GW and Medical Director of the GW Center for Integrative Medicine.
And I'm Janet Rodriguez, the office's Administrative Director. Today we talk about psilocybin and Alzheimer's with Albert Garcia-Romeu, PhD, a member of the Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences faculty at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine.
Dr. Albert Garcia-Romeu is the faculty at the Center for Psychedelics and Consciousness Research at Hopkins and also a guest researcher at the National Institute on Drug Abuse Intramural Neuroimaging Research Branch. His research examines the effects of psychedelics in humans with a focus on psilocybin as an aid in the treatment of addiction, and also, of course, we can talk about this in detail, of use of psilocybin for Alzheimer's.
Which just sounds like it's going to be fascinating. Dr. Garcia's current research interests include clinical applications of psychedelics, mindfulness, altered states of consciousness and their underlying neurobiological mechanisms, and the role of spirituality in mental health and addiction.
Welcome to GW Integrative Medicine, Albert.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's so great to have you. You and I caught some time a couple of weeks ago and had a great chat and came up with this idea to bring you onto a podcast. You have so much to share with us today, but I think we covered this topic a little bit already here, but let's start from the beginning. So let's talk about what is psychedelics and what is specifically psilocybin. And I think whatever you feel like telling our listeners, let's just do that instead of like me being specific.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm going to mainly focus on a specific class of drugs that we call classic psychedelics. And there's lots of different drugs that people sometimes call psychedelic, but pharmacologically, these classic psychedelics are specific because of their mechanism of action, which is a serotonin 2A receptor agonist. And there's a certain group of these, most of which are naturally occurring. So they're found in nature, in plants and fungi. And some of them have been synthesized in laboratories. And so, of course, the most famous of these is LSD, or lysergic acid diethylamide. But also psilocybin is among those classic psychedelics. And psilocybin is an alkaloid that's produced by about 200 different species of mushrooms, mostly in the Psilocybe genus, and they grow all over the world. And people have taken them for thousands of years in indigenous cultures. But more recently, there's been a big resurgence of research looking at psilocybin specifically as a potential mental health care treatment.
And so you started particularly getting interested in using the psychedelics and specifically psilocybin and Alzheimer's. How did that came up? Like, how did you think of it, and what's the story here?
Well, the story really was I was talking to a colleague, Dr. Paul Rosenberg here at Hopkins, who is doing research looking at dronabinol, which is THC from the cannabis plant, in patients with Alzheimer's and related dementias. And I approached him really to talk about that because I was interested in his work there. But he said, hey, you're a psilocybin researcher and an expert in that area. Has anybody thought about doing this with these patients, specifically folks who are showing up with early stage diagnosis, really when they're getting the news, which can be very, psychologically devastating. And, do you think this would be helpful or a possible direction to look at further research? And so we talked a bit about that. This was in part kind of spawned by similar work in cancer patients. And so our center, but also colleagues at UCLA and NYU, have published some nice papers looking at high-dose psilocybin with psychological support in cancer patients to really help them with their end-of-life distress, help reduce anxiety, help reduce depressed mood, and improve quality of life for the time that they have. And that was very successful. I mean, we saw just 1 or 2 high doses of psilocybin were able to reduce anxiety and depression and improve quality of life for up to 6 to 9 months after the drug dosing. And so for these effects to kind of be persistent like that is very unusual. But it's also consistent with other studies looking at psilocybin in treatment of major depression, as well as treatment-resistant major depression. And so nobody had really looked at this in this population, people with Alzheimer's or mild cognitive impairment. So we started work on this small pilot study that we were able to launch just around the end of 2019. Unfortunately, with the pandemic, that really kind of made it very difficult for us to do the work because all of the drug administration and that kind of thing, takes place in person at our laboratory. So we definitely experienced some setbacks there. But since then, we've been able to kind of get the ball rolling again, and we've been enrolling new participants and administering psilocybin. And now we're just measuring, mood-related effects to see if it helps with any sort of depressive symptoms, as well as other quality of life and memory-related tasks that we're measuring.
Right. So you guys looking specifically for now just for the quality of life measures, anxiety, stress levels, etc., right?
Yes, that's our primary aim, is to look at depressed mood, quality of life, and if those particular factors are impacted by the psilocybin dosing. But absolutely, as an exploratory aim, we are collecting measures using memory tasks, battery of cognitive testing and stuff, really just to see if there's anything there. And there's an interesting sort of backstory on that, which is, if you look at the preclinical literature on these serotonin 2A receptor agonist drugs, there's really a robust literature there that shows that they can be useful in animal models for improving things like memory consolidation and learning and accelerating learning processes. And those are kind of consistent with the idea that they could be cognitive enhancing in patients with something like MCI or Alzheimer's. And I think even more fascinating, in the last several years, we've seen more work coming out in animal models trying to understand the cellular and molecular mechanisms of these drugs and how they exert these persisting effects. And what they found is even a single dose of a classic psychedelic like psilocybin is associated with dendritogenesis, synaptogenesis in key areas of the brain like the prefrontal cortex. And those are new synapses and new connections between neurons that are forming. But they don't just stay there, they don't just form and go away. They actually are persisting for up to a month after the single exposure to the psychedelic. So that gives us an idea that from a structural standpoint, these types of drugs may be opening a period of plasticity in the brain that can help regrow new connections, which are the same types of connections that are degenerating in these types of conditions like Alzheimer's. So from a mechanistic standpoint, that gives us a really interesting direction to look at.
So, we have this very clear signal here, and it's not just in animals. There have been single case reports and in clinical realm, myself included, we hear patients tell us certain stories and we're all like, wow, has to be research, and yet you're the only center that I'm aware at Hopkins that is doing this, right? There's no one else particularly looking at of using psilocybin specifically for Alzheimer's.
Correct. I'm not aware of anybody else doing that at the moment.
So we have this situation. I'm just going to play a devil's advocate here. So we have this situation where in the last basically 2 years, we had two completely ineffective drugs. One got FDA approved with a high chances of serious side effects like brain edema and brain bleeding that cost, I'm talking about Adelheim, of course, that cost something like $70,000 or $80,000 a year, basically trying to get approved by Medicare. And here we have a psilocybin, right, that basically costs close to nothing and has potential, and nobody is really outside of just your institution is trying to look into this in a systematic way. I personally feel upset about it because I have a lot of patients asking me these questions, and the cannabis, of course, is also a fascinating one because there's also a pretty strong preclinical and animal models suggestions that this is a potential and it needs to be studied, and yet there's very little interest in that. All right, so we'll just leave it at that. I agree with you 100%. And what I would say is there's a number of factors here that are involved.
One of which is there's been a lot of stigmatization and taboo around these drugs. I mean, since the 1971 Controlled Substances Act, they were placed in the most highly restricted class of drugs, both cannabis and the psychedelics,
Sure.
Which made it very difficult to do research with them. But also, they were considered drugs of abuse and dangerous. And as such, there's a lot of concern, from people about anybody using these at all. But then, the other thing that I think makes it difficult is that this is not a proprietary molecule that Pfizer or some company owns. This is something that comes out of the ground, and we've known about for thousands of years. And so that also makes it difficult for people to capitalize on this as a medication development direction. And so I think between those political and economic types of factors, those are some of the things that have been setbacks for this type of research.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's but we're seeing a climate about all the substances are rapidly changing. I mean, as we doing this podcast, there's a conversation at the government, to try to significantly shift at least the cannabis, and I think psilocybin following very closely in footsteps. And it's more of a question when rather than if the substance is going to get rescheduled or descheduled. We'll have to see, but. And hopefully from our clinicians' side of things, it's essential that we see a quick change in the potential for research at the minimum, because obtaining Schedule I controlled substance is a chore, and it's very difficult, as you said, to do this research. Once that shifts, I think there's going to be a lot more opportunities, and this is, you'll tell us a little bit more about this, but I'm assuming it's a study where you probably get a lot of interested patients. Now, the screening, of course, is always tricky into the studies, but how is the recruitment going?
Well, I would say, over the last few years, we've had a better time with recruitment just because of the media popularity around these studies that we're working on. Mm-hmm. And so things like Michael Pollan and, Netflix documentaries and stuff has really piqued a lot of people's interest. But I also don't know that has necessarily penetrated to, some of the population who would be dealing with things like Alzheimer's and dementia. And as a result, I think this study has been particularly challenging for us to get people in the door. And of course, the screening issues that you mentioned, because we're, looking at not just people who are depressed, people who have some sort of Alzheimer's or MCI diagnosis, but then oftentimes they have other medical conditions that may make it difficult for us to include them in these studies. So, yeah, it's been an uphill battle, I would say, so far. But we are gaining traction, and doing these types of podcasts and this type of publicity, I think, is helpful so that people are aware that this is going on and that they may be eligible to join a study like this.
Mm. Since you mentioned Michael Pollan, not that we're going to talk to him anytime soon, but we have invited him and you too to talk at the upcoming Mushroom Conference in the fall next year. So we'll give our listeners more of information, but it's going to be more medical. But we will invite anybody actually, because we're going to try to be a bit more general instead of very, very specific on particular research issues. So we're going to do more of a both research and clinical conference in the fall.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's great to be inclusive that way.
Yeah, and I think there's so much to learn here and so much to educate others. I in my own hometown where I am, I'm in Tacoma Park in Maryland, and I recently sent my cannabis book to one of our delegates who's leading the cannabis work in Maryland. So I think it's sort of we have to do our due diligence to try to promote the topic of pushing the research uphill, because, as you said, it's been difficult. So let's shift to you guys doing so many different studies at the Center for Psychedelics and Consciousness Research at Hopkins. Do you want to just kind of overview what's going on there?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, really historically, what had happened was 2006, 2008, Roland Griffiths and the team here, this was before I had gotten here, published a couple of papers in healthy volunteers just showing that high-dose psilocybin was safe, and that it was also associated with not only profoundly meaningful experiences, but experiences that seemed to continue to have positive well-being benefits that lasted for months or longer. And that really pushed the center here to grow and start looking in clinical directions. And so with Matt Johnson and colleagues, we published a small paper looking at psilocybin and treatment of tobacco smoking cessation, cigarette smokers who wanted to quit. That was a small study, pilot study, but it looked very promising. And so now we're doing more follow-up work on that front, where we've done a randomized control trial and have another double-blind placebo-controlled trial for cigarette smokers who want to quit using psilocybin, which we're working on. So that's been one very promising direction. But also, I've mentioned some of the work in cancer patients. It's looked good, and that's continuing to grow. There's other centers, even in Maryland, that are working on new papers, new research studies in cancer patients. But really, the field has exploded, and we went from having maybe a handful or a couple dozen studies, worldwide, to over 120 studies now with psilocybin on clinicaltrials.gov. And so, if you want to look for studies, that's a really good place to go, because that's where they're all registered. Clinicaltrials.gov, the website. But our center has been, part of that in terms of starting to look at other clinical directions. So specifically, my colleague, Dr. Natalie Gakassian, is working on a study of psilocybin in patients with anorexia nervosa. We're working on a new study to start soon in psilocybin in people with obsessive compulsive disorder. We have studies going on now with psilocybin treatment for people with comorbid alcohol use disorder and major depression. We also have studies in people with chronic Lyme disease. The study that I'm working on now in people with early stage Alzheimer's disease and depressed mood. Trying to think of what else we got on the plate. I think we'll have a study starting next year in cannabis dependence, one in opioid dependence, and one in post-traumatic stress disorder. I think that's everything, but it's that's off the top of my head, so don't quote me. So.
That is really impressive. The chronic Lyme disease, we're definitely going to want to have you come back and talk to us about that when that one's done, because one of the members of the GW Integrative Medicine team, Dr. Andy Heyman, is like an expert on Lyme disease.
Oh, that's great. And it's been so fascinating because really I ended up just like, we were able to work with Dr. Rosenberg, who's a, expert in geriatric neuropsychiatry, to help us with the Alzheimer's study. I was also really fortunate to link up with a really great expert here at Hopkins, Dr. John Alcott, who's been working on Lyme disease research for a couple of decades now. And so he has been instrumental in helping me kind of shape this small pilot study that we're working on now. But just like with the cancer patients and the patients with Alzheimer's, we're kind of looking at not will the psilocybin fix the Lyme disease per se, but will it help people in terms of their psychological outlook? Will it improve their quality of life? And, does it provide any sort of symptom remission, things like chronic pain, sleep or fatigue problems, concentration or cognitive difficulties? So, those are the directions that we're looking there right now.
I just find it so fascinating that some of the substances that clearly have potential of partially rewiring some of our connectivity in the brain can have this effects on the chronic medical problems that, in the past, we would not have necessarily thought of trying to fix by not doing something clearly biological, like giving a drug or but it makes a lot of sense. If you think about all these conditions, it's not just that the stress plays the huge role. There is an inflammatory component. There is a component of degenerative processes in the brain, but not actually only in the brain, in other tissues. And so, you have these substances that can do a shift. And what I find totally fascinating is that shift can occur very, very quickly. And I would love to hear your take on this, because, in sometimes in clinical practice, we see patients will report to us they went on some retreat and came back and they're completely different.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the most fascinating aspects of these drugs is that, it seems like these psychedelics have the potential to be rapid-acting treatments in the sense that, one single high-dose experience for some people can you know, help put them, you know, in remission from depression within 24 or 48 hours of taking the drug. People with substance use disorders, you know, it can really help them make changes in their behavioral patterns around substance use. And we've seen that with our cigarette smokers, many of whom who have quit and stayed quit for a long term. And so, you know, that remains a bit of a mystery. You know, why is it that we can see such rapid shifts, and why they last so long after just a single experience with these drugs? But, you know, you're right. There are all these different biological mechanisms at play, you know, from the cellular neuroplasticity to, you know, changes in brain network dynamics, things like anti-inflammatory effects that we know these psychedelics also have. They're potent anti-inflammatory effects. And then I think the other kind of piece of the puzzle that's really important is that people can have extremely meaningful, sometimes they might describe them as spiritual or existential types of experiences when they're under the influence of these psychedelics. And that in itself, I think, can be a big wake-up call for people to think about themselves or their lives differently, or to put things in perspective for them. And, you know, that in itself can really help facilitate the therapeutic process is what it, you know, seems to me.
Whole body health.
Oh yeah. And this is really an integrative type of treatment, because this is not about, you know, giving somebody a drug and then they get better, kind of like a mechanism that is purely biological, but there's a huge psychological, and I would say even spiritual component involved in a lot of this type of work.
Now, what type of resources do you have on Hopkins' website for people just interested in learning, you know, lay people interested in learning a little more about this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So all of our work is on our website, which is hopkinspsychedelic.org. And so if anybody wants to learn more about what we have going on at the center, they can always visit our website, hopkinspsychedelic.org. That has, you know, a listing of the team members. It has our currently enrolling research projects. It also has a listing of all of our publications over the last 20 years. And so, you know, that's a great resource. We try to keep it up to date. Put lots of news stories up there as well, because there's a lot of great media out there about this type of stuff. And, you know, certainly, you know, when this podcast is released, we'll share it as well on our social media. And so people can follow the lab at, you know, Twitter or on Facebook as well. And we're on LinkedIn. So all of those different channels are available if people want to find out what we're doing or reach out to us.
Albert, do you have any clinical pearls that you'd like to share with folks before we sign off?
You know, I think right now we're still a little too early on, you know, specifically if we're talking about the Alzheimer's disease work, because we've only enrolled about 5 people. So it's hard for me to make, you know, big generalizations or statements about what we're finding. But what I do think is important to kind of take away from this conversation is that, you know, some of the stigma around these substances is not particularly well founded. You know, the toxicity potential is fairly low in terms of potential for harm to the body. Psychological effects, you know, they can be intense, but we know how to manage that pretty well. And we've done it in hundreds of people over the last 20 years here at Hopkins, and other labs are, you know, taking the ball and running with it. So I think there's going to be a lot more work on the horizon. And, you know, we're kind of moving towards a medical approval in the next few years. So, you know, I think it's just an exciting time to be both part of the field and doing this work, but also for, I think, practitioners and, you know, other people in the healthcare field to potentially think about how they might be able to integrate this within their own clinical practice.
I feel like we're like in this very, very early phases, and we all have this belief that there's going to be an impact. But of course, you know, the science is always takes a lot longer than we would like.
It sure does. It's a slow-moving process, but yeah, but it's going. You know, it's going the right direction.
Yeah, it's going the right direction, and you know, I think what we'll have to do is, as you guys grow and get more data, we'll bring you back at some point and kind of do this on a somewhat regular basis, where we can keep giving our listeners more information about where things standing.
Absolutely, anytime. And I'm not the only person, and I'm certainly not doing all the work that I talked about. There's a lot of folks at the center with a lot of great information. Dr. Fred Barrett is a neuroscientist, Dr. Nally Gukasian, Dr. David Yaden. So we've got, a growing team here that is really helping to move this work forward together.
And I do want to give a credit. The person who connected us is my longtime friend, Rael Khan. He's at UCSD, right?
Yeah, he's over in California. That's correct.
In California, yeah. So he's also studying this. There's a lot of other people studying this. I mean, the process of research here is happening. It's not like it's just one entity. I mean, maps, of course, and so there's a lot of interest and a lot of research going slowly. It's just too slow for us. But
yeah,
I want to make sure that we give full credit for Rael for getting us together, and so we'll make sure that when the podcast comes out, Janet, and make sure that we don't forget that we'll put in the link to upcoming conference in there, so anybody who would like to sign up for it can do so.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Albert. This was wonderful. We'll have you back sooner or later. Maybe before we close, anything else you want to add that you feel like you want to share with listeners?
No, I think we covered a lot of great ground here. So just, thank you all for having me on and appreciate the conversation.
And that is all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us, Albert.
Thank you.
This is the GW Integrative Medicine Podcast from the GW Office of Integrative Medicine and Health.
I'm Dr. Misha Kogan.
And I'm Janet Rodriguez. Thanks for listening.
The Office of Integrative Medicine and Health produces the GW Integrative Medicine Podcast with funds from your donations. Your generosity allows us to raise awareness of the benefits of integrating whole person care, including evidence-based complementary therapies, into healthcare broadly. Help us continue to grow the podcast by making a tax-deductible donation on our website, smhs.gwu.edu/OIMH. Click the Give Now button on the left. While you're there, sign up for our free monthly newsletter for even more evidence-based content, including free webinars.